would like to thank Alexion Pharmaceuticals, argenx, Horizon Therapeutics, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, Regeneron, and UCB for their generous support of this symposium. Welcome our panelists, Dr. Kristen Herlein from Janssen, Dr. Ching Lum from Regeneron, Dr. Sanjay Rapad from Alexion, and Dr. Omar Sino from UCB, and Dr. Tru Yen from argenx, and we will let them kind of give more of an introduction. But we wanted to thank you all for being here today. Thanks for sitting tight while we had some technical difficulties. We appreciate you being here and sharing your time and insights with the MG community. So Dr. Wolfe, take it away.
So yeah, I'll just ask all of you, and I guess we can start in the upper left with Dr. Herlein. She can start and just say a little bit about, your career and what your current job is, and then we'll get to some questions. So
yeah, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Christine Herlein. I'm representing Janssen. I am the Global Medical Affairs Leader for Neurology, and I'm also a neurologist by training, so working passionately on developing new drugs for myasthenia gravis. And I'm very, very happy to be here. So thanks very much for inviting me.
And next, Dr. Lum.
Yeah, so Ching Lum, my background is a pharmacist. I actually went to pharmacy school at University of Buffalo with Dr. Wolfe. Yeah, I've been in industry for the last almost 20 years or so. My last 6 years, I actually spent at Alexion. We're working on the complement portfolio within hematology and nephrology, and I actually recently joined Regeneron. I'm the medical affairs lead for our myasthenia gravis as well as our some of rare disease programs. So happy to be here and happy to share any insights we can from Regeneron.
Continuing to the right, Dr.
Yep. So I'm Sanjay Rakade. I work as an executive medical director in the clinical development group at Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease Unit, and have been with Alexion for more than 3 years now. I oversee complement inhibitors and the clinical development of complement inhibitors in the neuromuscular disease space. I'm a neurologist by training as well, although not a neuromuscular person, but a clinical neurophysiology, so done lots of EMGs. And I'd just start off by saying that it is really exciting times currently in the myasthenia gravis disease space. There's multiple options available and many more on the horizon. So I'm really excited about the trajectory of the therapeutic space with myasthenia gravis.
Dr. Sino?
Hi, I'm Omar Sino. I'm the U.S. Medical Strategy Lead for Rare Neuromuscular and Neuroinflammatory Disease at UCB. That's for both our complement inhibitor and our FcRn inhibitor. I'm a physician by training, spent many, many years in the very, very small startup world. I'm happy to be back. Larger companies, happy to be with all of you today.
Great. Thanks for being part of it, all of you so far. And finally, Dr. I'm going to mispronounce the name, so I'll let you say.
Okay, I'll start by saying it as it's pronounced in Flemish, where I'm from, Luc Truyen. But thanks for the effort, guys. I just want to start by thanking MDA for the invitation, and in particular the patients for giving their time to us also in these discussions. So I'm also a neurologist by training, but I'm more in the central neuroimmunology field, so I work mainly in MS. And the reason I bring that up is that I see a lot of parallels with how that field evolved and where myasthenia is today. And we can learn a lot of lessons and also a lot of hope take away from there. Because today it's almost impossible to do new studies in MS, relapsing remitting MS, because we've suppressed the relapses so much, the studies become very large. So, and I hope to contribute to that evolution for myasthenia as well.
That's great. And yeah, there are a lot of parallels, and we've learned a lot from the MS field, both in MG and even in things like inflammatory neuropathies. We tried to learn lessons. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, from things that were going on in multiple sclerosis. We actually tried some of the MS drugs in CIDP, for instance, earlier in my career. So, I'm going to moderate this part and interject if I have something useful to say, but mostly to hear the voices from our industry participants here. What are the biggest challenges, just so the audience can know, biggest challenges in MG drug development? Obviously, we're dealing with a disease much less common, a 20th as common or 30th as common as MS, but what are some of the other challenges and so forth in MG drug development?
So I'll go first. I think not only to MG, but obviously to MG because we're in rare and there's smaller patient population, of course. But I think it's obviously we're going to have to consider more than we have already the socioeconomic and racial disparities in our clinical trials. I think it's not news to say that we have a tough time getting to underserved populations, rural populations, and really sort of trying to address those social determinants of health, and including seronegative patients. I think is also a very important challenge.
Anybody else? Those are great points.
Yeah, I agree with those. One of the foundational things is, and maybe Dr. Wolfe, you don't like to hear this, but when we engaged with the patient communities, one of the challenges we found was a disconnect between the physician's perspective, how the patient was doing, and the patient's perspective of how they were doing day to day. And I think as we think about developing new treatments, we have to think about what dimensions are important for these patients to address and really take that with us. And also involve them in how we design our trials, what's doable for them in their situation.
Yeah, it's a great point. I just want to maybe add on to that, and doing drug development is hard, right? And then rare disease just adds another layer on top of that. And I think it's about making sure we find what's important to the patients, right? When we're looking at developing trials and studies, and making sure the endpoints we look at is relevant to the patients. So really taking all that into consideration, and also making sure that there's ways for the trials and the opportunities to even be a part of trials to be more visible, right? So patients are even aware and physicians are aware.
Yeah, I also think a lack of awareness of clinical trial options, and also to a degree, a lack of a coordinated activism on behalf of patients to demand actually the exploration of newer and better treatment options. I think both of these things, the MDA as well as the Symposium, really is really playing a really important role here. And also, I think we've heard about the rareness, right? It can be challenging to recruit, but also to retain patients in trials. As the disease is rare, the centers are rare, so we have to kind of clear houses for informations and channels that connect patients, PIs, centers to the science are really vital to advancing the field. And I also thought about the point on the treatment inertia. I mean, there were recent publications about this. Kind of an acceptance of a suboptimal symptom control due to a perceived concern on changing MG therapy, right, which leads to a good enough acceptance rather than an expected better, and really can lead to an underparticipation in clinical trials. So I think the science now is there. We have progressed to a point where physicians as well as patients can really demand a better, and a better than like yesterday is good enough.
So Dr. Herrlein, if I could add to your point, I think having that conversation about, or that point about treatment inertia, and we're talking about making it easier to get accessibility to trial. I think that concept of health literacy comes into play a little bit more. In rare, patients generally know a lot, but we can't assume that they always know everything, right? Mm-hmm. And I think if the health literacy or education improves, then you have that, it's easier to bridge that discussion about, hey, I'm stable, but I want to get better, right? Is there a clinical trial? Can you consider me? What are the barriers that I might find getting to that trial?
So one other point that perhaps I would also add there is, I agree with almost everything that has been said before. I think the rarity of the disease and the presence of these multiple therapeutic options under development with specific mechanisms of action, finding the right trial for the right patient also becomes an important aspect of this enterprise. And the second aspect is also designing trials that not only help us meet our approval criteria for these, but also provide access to these patients post-approval, because this aspect of treatment inertia and the health literacy on the patient side also translates into a lack of access to a certain extent post-approval as well. And anything that we can do to further those goals while designing our clinical trials becomes equally important. And we definitely at Alexion try to incorporate that into our thinking when we design these trials.
No, I think those are all great points. And I'm just going to make one additional point regarding the comment. I agree. I don't think 10, 15 years ago, we were very good at really assessing what the patient experience was. I think we're getting better at it. We're not perfect at it. We have some new scales that help. You know, I advocate, and a lot of other docs do as well, to use something like the MG-ADL in the clinical practice, so you have a better idea of what the patient's what the patient experience is like. We ask better questions. I think we pry better about side effects. The side effect proportions from, you know, even medium doses of prednisone are dramatically bad. If you're on doses of prednisone really even above 5 milligrams a day, you can see prominent side effects. So again, thinking about newer mechanisms of action that have a better, more favorable side effect profile that work faster as well, I think is important. The next question, and you know, I have thoughts about this, but where do you all see MG treatment going in the next 5 years? We have a lot of trials. I think there's an expectation we're going to see more drugs, maybe even another mechanism of action or two. What are all your thoughts?
Yeah, if I may, and this is another parallelism with MS, of course. Given that we're now working on mechanisms of actions that truly go to the driver of the disease, the autoantibodies, we certainly think that would warrant or would cause in the next 5 years to have treatment with these causative treatments earlier and earlier, and not, as you say, Dr. Wolfe, the deleterious effects of steroids. And I think, therefore, that we will see, just as in the MS field, maybe biologic treatment much earlier in our thinking about therapies. Certainly the steps we're taking at argenx.
So somebody way more smarter than I am said, I believe some point in time we'll get to the point where you have drugs enough that we can get to patients that are naive to nonsteroidal ISTs, like they never had to get on nonsteroidal ISTs. So beyond that, obviously T and B cell inhibitors, plasma cell inhibitors, but I think downstream CAR T therapy has really the potential to, be potentially curative. I say that with a very touch of salt, but like you said earlier, Dr. Rahadi, it's an incredibly interesting time.
Do you want to I did not show my CAR T slides when I gave my lecture. I have several. Do you want to just briefly describe to the audience what CAR T therapy is like? It was first used in cancer, but we're actually taking a patient's cells out and designing them to attack a certain thing. Do you just want to describe how that could work in an autoimmune disease?
Yeah, so I'll take a shot, and you can correct me, Dr. Wolfe, which I'm sure which I can count on you to do. So in CAR T therapy, you're taking a cell, and basically if you have a pathogenic B cell, CAR T is basically training your own T cells to attack those bad B cells. So you're basically using the immune players against each other.
And so instead of attacking a certain, say, cancer antigen, you can attack a certain antigen, say, on a B cell. Like there's one called BCMA, B cell maturation antigen, and use the patient's own cells, take them out and design them in a laboratory and I don't know how to do it because I don't do that kind of work, but in some type of cell culture type system, and then give them back to the patient to attack a certain element of the immune process and knock down a immune-mediated disease that way. And so that's being looked at in several forms of myasthenia gravis. Just early studies. The initial data, I can tell you, because it's been publicly released, has looked favorable in a very small number of patients, granted. But anyway, that could be something that we see introduced in MG. This therapy is already used in certain types of leukemias and lymphomas, by the way. Any other thoughts about where 5 years from now, your predictions?
Yeah.
What are we going to be looking at in 2027, 2028?
So I think, I mean, coming back to the comment by Dr. Turan and expanding on it a bit further, as in other common neurological disorders, I think that patient preference and patient desires for flexibility or for continued efficacy will continue to play a role or will become more prominent in choosing the medications that we, or the therapeutics that we, as neurologists, prescribe to these patients. We feel that with the different mechanisms of actions available and also different routes of administration, including some that Alexion is bringing forth as well in terms of subcutaneous delivery, intravenous infusion, oral therapeutics. I think as these come onto the market, the patient preference for what suits their lifestyle is going to start making more and more of an impact on what treatments get prescribed.
Yeah,
And in that same vein, if I may just add one other thought, I think that eventually the switching of some of these therapies or even concomitant medications for patients who are not controlled on a single therapy, which is a fair majority of myasthenia gravis patients, that's also going to become more and more important as myasthenia becomes a manageable disorder and we start making movements towards making it something that the patients can live with instead of just coping with moving forward.
Yeah, it's treatment optionality, right? I mean, it's, if you think about where this conversation was 5 years ago, I think it would be very different, right? Versus today. And I think in 5 years, we'll have different targets, right? Not just complement, not just FcRn, there'll be other targets. And what we know is in these diseases, not every patient responds the same to whatever that treatment is, right? The more options that the patient have, the better that patient from prognosis perspective. And then even if you have a treatment, can you lessen that treatment burden, right? Whether it's extending the intervals for when something is administered, how often they have to go to an infusion center. So I think we look at this both ways. So I think in 5 years, I think we'll certainly be, there'll be much more optionality in this sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd like to also kind of echo like the excitement in the area right now. I also see the parallel to the field of multiple sclerosis maybe 20 years ago. We are now much better understanding the pathophysiology of MG, but also, and it was touched upon as well, immune-mediated disorders. Like we are understanding them better, in our case, autoantibody diseases, right? And as a consequence, we see more and more approaches that are used in other therapy areas in our field. So several mechanisms of action that can be helpful beyond oncology, beyond immunology, even for our diseases. So therefore, I feel in 5 years, I would expect this could change the currently accepted treatment paradigm tremendously, actually. And hopefully we'll also be able to change the overall disease course, hopefully with disease-modifying therapies. And I would expect also the use of like more targeted, more effective treatment options earlier, I think was mentioned as well. And this comes together with, there's a lot of research ongoing in the field of biomarkers. So if we can identify biomarkers that tell us this patient is going to respond to a certain treatment options, so I think we will really enter a new era and see really a different algorithm how patients are treated in the future. Really, really looking forward to that.
Maybe just explain a little bit to the audience how a biomarker might work. what a biomarker is, and whether we get it from the blood or from electrophysiologic measure, but how that could help us move patients into a certain type of treatment as opposed to another. Anybody want to make a comment on that, or?
I mean, do you want me to explain it? I mean, like just say let's take a blood, right, and estimate like one of the biomarkers that are identified that will actually, if you have it, if it's positive in your blood, then you're very likely to respond to a certain treatment. So your physician will actually exactly know which kind of treatment to give you as a patient. And that will really help, because like very often we are actually not sure, are the patients going to respond or not? But this will really go more in the direction really of more precise or more precision medicine.
So they do this in cancer all the time now, in different cancers. If there's a certain marker, a certain gene or whatnot, say in breast cancer, it drives you into a certain treatment paradigm that has a better outcome than just treating them the way that everybody was treated 20 years ago or something like that. So
but
I think that is going to come in MG and other diseases too. I want to move
agreed. Oh, sorry, Dr. Wolfe. I just want to extend one argument, if I may, which is we define things seropositive, seronegative, but what is actually seronegative? Is it because it hasn't been found yet, or it's one that's not by the assay? So I think that's an important discussion that maybe we don't get to later, but it ties into the biomarker. Let's fully develop what we already have also.
Yeah. Well, we did mention that some seronegative patients probably have acetylcholine receptor antibodies. The Oxford and some of the other studies have shown that if you use a more sensitive assay, a cell-based assay, than what we typically do. Access. How to increase access to exciting drugs in the MG community, or even not just for available drugs, but those that are under investigation. What are some of your companies doing to try to do that, to improve patient access? There's a lot of criticism sometimes for patient access programs that the pharmaceutical industry create to help patients, say, get a certain drug approved for their condition. But just some of your comments from the industry perspective on that.
Perhaps I can start off with talking a bit more about access to the clinical trial process for patients, since we're at the Clinical Development Roundtable. I think democratizing access to information about clinical trials is important. I think there isn't enough information about clinical trials that's available to a majority of our patients. And especially trial diversity is an issue that we all deal with across companies, and it's becoming more and more important. If you look at Alzheimer's trials and other trials, it's one of the things that's definitely very much being pursued in those neurological conditions. So that part of broadening the access to clinical trial process and being able to communicate or disseminate that information, that's one thing. I think along the same lines, getting patient input into the design of our trials, where we try to have advocacy groups like the MDA or MGFA, but also individual patient representatives or individual patient advocates actually take a look at trial protocols and give us an idea about where they see the protocol burden or the visit burden, and trying to work with patient advocates and advocacy groups to reduce that to the extent possible to make the trial more accessible. I see that as something that can be definitely addressed in terms of access to clinical trials. I'll let my other colleagues also speak to it, and then perhaps talk about access to therapies.
I would very much agree to what you've just said. And I think even the session today, right, like this information session is really to connect patients with studies and really investigative like treatments of tomorrow, right? And I think it's important, I think it was also kind of mentioned, we have to really listen to patients to ensure, while we are designing the rigorously controlled studies, that we also capture what's really valuable for patients. And we also, while doing that, we need to ensure that patients' experience in participating in clinical trials is really a good one. So on the one hand, personally, of course, but also on the other hand, a meaningful way to advance the science on behalf of all patients living with MG. I think also a final barrier may be also perhaps like winning the hearts and minds that really new treatments are within reach, that may offer a better control and a better side effect profile than the current standard of care.
Yeah, again, agree with all that is said. A concept that worked in some areas is the concept of the patient scientist, where they become totally interested in what's the disease. And again, I go to MS when I was practicing. People came with dot matrix printouts of new papers and said, "Doctor, what do you think of this? Shouldn't I try this?" And I think the MDA, by bringing this group together, there's other groups, and starting to harness, hey, what do I want as a patient is a key part of our future endeavors.
So I mentioned health literacy earlier, and it's something that I actually really enjoy talking about. And I think we all do our part to try to help educate ourselves, but also the community. If I think about access, specifically to access to medication reimbursement, for example, ADL has become a very important tool that payers utilize to evaluate authorization, reauthorization. So I really think it's important for us to help the community in any way that we can utilize the MG-ADL as accurately as possible. Yes, of course, you know, physician, doctor, do it at the visit, but in a hectic office, in a patient that maybe doesn't fully understand the ins and outs of the ADL and doesn't really understand the time frame over the last week, et cetera, I think some nuance can be lost there. So I think actual access via reimbursement ties in nicely to education and the MG-ADL specifically.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment, because I know the MG-ADL pretty well, and you're right. It does require some introduction, but honestly, it's a simple enough scale. After the first or second time that patients do it, for subsequent visits, I think they largely get it. You may have to remind them the time scale that it's usually the last week or 2 weeks that you're referring to as far as have you had these problems. But it's a pretty quick indicator, and I think we do pretty well with it after that initial kind of introduction to what the scale is. Yeah.
Dr. Wolfe, it's a beautifully designed PRO, no doubt.
Well, I can't say that when we designed it in Texas, I was in Dallas when we designed it. I can't say that we spent hour upon hour upon hour devising the language. Now, Carolina Barnett, my colleague just across the border in Toronto, she has done that and gotten huge patient input into something that's called the MG Impairment Index that we're starting to use. This ocular myasthenia gravis trial I mentioned, we're going to use the MG Impairment Index. But anyway, the MG-ADL has largely worked, although an issue came up of a patient of Chip Howard's who really should have had a high or a pretty high score of the MG-ADL, but the way we worded the MG-ADL, the patient, they had adapted to their deficits, and it wasn't requiring any extra effort for them to say to comb their hair, brush their teeth. We could have worded it in a different way.
But
And
Dr.
then
Wolfe,
we might have captured a higher score than what the patient offered because the way it was phrased was not good. So, but we weren't thinking in that way 20 years ago. But anyway,
no,
But this goes
scales are.
yeah,
I'm
this
sorry,
goes
in
to
seriousness, I'm sorry, Luke, I keep cutting you off. Go ahead.
no, I mean, if you talk about access, willingness to pay is driven by, do you recognize the cost you're already bearing with managing this disease? And we here at argenx have put quite some effort into uncovering that, and it's actually remarkably high if you think about it. So that should help. That's part of the effort we need to make, but the other part is show the value for the patient themselves, of course.
Any other comments on the access issue?
I mean,
Because
I
we're going to
agree
go
with
quickly. We're going to
everyone.
spin. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say that
Dr. Lum.
just, certainly make sure that we continuously and sort of actively work with the patient organizations. And to sort of your point before around the language, right? Making sure what we're communicating is in a fashion or something that patient can understand and take away with, right? Not using any things that are sort of more in our world, the jargon and sort of the clinical development world.
So I remember, because I was on the MSAB and I was either the vice chair or the chair when it first was introduced, whether we should have pharma closer linked to the MG Foundation of America, because it was controversial, the way academic physicians are. But I really do think that partnership has helped lead to where we are now. That partnership of working together and having industry's voice has helped move the field forward. But I do remember some of the internal conversations where there were positions on both sides about that, as far as access to patients, the societies that help the patients, and so forth. Maybe some of you want to talk about specifically. By the way, I used to be a print journalist, so I like doing these kinds of things. I was actually a newspaper reporter before I was a doctor. How are your companies getting patients more involved in the MG drug development process? I know some have, some of the companies have created apps and things like that. So just anybody who wants to speak up to that.
And maybe I can.
Yes,
so
please.
like at Janssen, we are moving away from doing things like for patient towards really doing things in more partnership with patients. So we've engaged patients living with MG during our study design development, really to incorporate their insights, their perspective, and really learn what's important to them. And I think this aspect on patient centricity is especially important to disease like MG, because the fluctuating nature of the disease means that while all patients have muscle weakness, every person's experience is different and varies over time. So therefore, we must really take this into consideration when we are developing our endpoints. And so they need to be tailored to patients' lived experiences. And we are committed to also engage the advocacy groups to raise the awareness on the drug development, clinical trials, and really provide information which is useful for patients.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, proof is in the pudding, and I can't take any credit for this because I wasn't at argenx yet, but ADAPT was designed directly based on patient input, and I can read the transcripts of what the patients said they felt would be good design. Design was great. It showed the drug worked, but it also gave us some other insights. So I think it's a matter of actually doing it. That's how you get more engagement. You really do the reach out and show that you're implementing.
Yeah. And I'll just mention briefly that MG Impairment Index was generated via patient input. Canadians granted, but Canadians are reasonable people. I think some of the more reasonable people in the world. So I think it's a very nice instrument that deserves some more attention, and I think we're starting to move in that direction. Other comments, though, about patient engagement, involvement.
I think we just got to continuously to collect insights, right? Because what we know now can be very different down the road, and whether we need to do it both at a local level, regional level, national level, in person, virtual. I mean, check all the boxes, check all the above, right? And making sure we have a process to continuously gather that insights.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of the comments previously made. I think a continuous engagement with the patients is very important for the drug development process as well as the eventual access to these therapies. And the MG-ADL so far has been the gold standard for even getting access to some of our therapies. But as you mentioned, Dr. Wolfe and others have hinted at as well, access to a therapy that's dependent on a test that's conducted once every 6 months or once every year in a clinician's office is perhaps not the best route of engagement for eventual treatment. And then some of these other aspects with digital initiatives, I mean, that's an important pillar of prescription of treatment, but the effects that they have eventually, even for monitoring by a physician. And if there are apps that, or apps or other digital initiatives, or even surveys, e-diaries for that matter, that help physicians and patients remain in touch over the course of the patient experience with MG, which varies day to day. That's super important in my consideration, at least, and I think in the consideration of most physicians.
Okay. Any last comment? Because there are certain comments. I'm just looking at the chat, and I want to try to address these in, say, the last 15 minutes or so that we have. And okay, so I want to just, and I think Dr. Heerlein, you had some thoughts about seronegative myasthenia gravis. There's always questions about that from the patients at different meetings. So how can we better address the seronegative MG question and help us as far as the evolution of these newer therapies in that particular population?
I think it's a challenging field, right? Because it's just a small subgroup of already a rare disease. So finding enough patients for randomized controlled trials and then show even statistically significant superiority is really a huge task. And so we hope the field will advance over the next year, and we will identify more and more autoantibodies. So if that's not the case, there's of course always the risk you include patients that are actually not having myasthenia gravis, and that can lead to a wrong outcome in a trial. But really based on the unmet need at Janssen, so we also took the risk in our Vivacity study and include seronegative MG patients, because we think there is a good scientific rationale, and we really hope to see the data very soon.
Yeah, I can only second that. The unmet need is there. We hear those patient voices, and we have systematically included seronegatives in our trials, leading even to approval of that population in Japan. But it is an ongoing discussion. The science and the data have to evolve. We just submitted our subcutaneous, again, with seronegatives included, and we'll have the dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I think as the science progresses and we learn more about the seronegative patients and perhaps the antibodies implicated within some of these seronegative patients, I think the science will guide the way for us. We also have to be mindful of some of the scientific underpinnings for the therapies that we bring forward. And in certain instances where acetylcholine receptor seropositivity, which is IgG1 related, and how it works into the mechanism of action of certain therapeutics or the pathogenesis of myasthenia gravis in those individuals, marrying those two to provide the best result possible for these patients within our trials and within the patient group where these therapies are prescribed becomes important.
In short, though, just for reassuring all the seronegative MG patients who may be listening, there are ways you can carefully set up entry criteria that I think we can be pretty certain we're dealing with an MG patient and say not another form of neuromuscular disease like a congenital myasthenic syndrome or even a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy of sorts. I just mentioned that because I see LGMD mentioned on the chat. I'll get to that in a second. Then we can be pretty rest assured we really are entering a patient who has true MG into the trial. There are ways to do that. I think we've designed a scheme for that. We just put the grant into the NIH a week ago to allow us to enroll up to a third of the population being seronegative in this ocular MG trial. That's what we're hoping to be able to do. I want to get to some of these comments and questions. One was limb-girdle. I guess I'll have to answer the limb-girdle, but if any of you know about limb-girdle, yeah, all right. There are a lot of different forms of muscular dystrophy. That's what the MDA is primarily set up to serve, are the muscular dystrophy patients. The MDA is the Muscular Dystrophy Association, but they cover MG and other diseases as well, inflammatory myopathies, Charcot-Marie tooth disease, which is a hereditary neuropathy, is under the MDA umbrella, the organization that's sponsoring this right now. All right. The only specific therapy we have for muscular dystrophies right now is for Duchenne. And there are a few therapies out there. They don't work great. They are going to keep boys out of a wheelchair a few years longer. That's not how the trials were designed. They were designed more on 6-minute walk tests and respiratory function and so forth. But yes, there are some specific therapies, but we need more. We need better ones for Duchenne. Limb-girdle, you're right. We don't have a specific therapy for limb-girdle, but I can assure you there are trials going on for, say, now there's like 30 or 40 different forms of autosomal recessive limb-girdle now, which is why we don't call them 2A, 2B, 2C anymore, because we ran out of letters. So they just recently changed the classifications to R. Most limb-girdles are recessive. The R is recessive. There are some dominant forms as well. That classification now starts with a D, D1, D2, D3, R1, R2, R3. The alpha-sarcoglycanopathies have been studied in quite a few trials in limb-girdle. That's one of the Rs. I think it's either R5. It used to be 2D, and I think it's R5, or it might be R4. Anyway, there are trials going on. FKRP is another form of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So there are trials in small groups of populations going on to see if we can find a way to start making some inroads in treating limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. Just so you know, for some of the adeno-associated viral vectors used to replace genes, there have been a few. Again, we've had some problems with side effects. And so sometimes severe, and so that's kind of slowed things down a little bit as they're kind of revamping and trying to make delivery of these different vectors safer. But I think we'll get there. It's just taking, it's going to take a while. It's taken longer than I thought it would have, say, earlier in my career 30 years ago. So that's all I can really say about limb-girdle. But yeah, limb-girdles and the muscular dystrophies in general, and ALS also is an area of neuromuscular medicine that we really need to make advances on. Okay. Online consultations. You can easily find my email because SUNY requires us to have our emails out there. So you can go ahead and email me and we can go from there. Okay. What is being, again, another seronegative question about the latest treatments? I feel that we're overlooked. I think we talked about that. If there's any further questions that we didn't answer on the seronegative angle, please just add it to the chat. Ethics. To explain the issue of ethics in the research drug trial process. You know, ethics, there was something called the Belmont Report. Most Western countries, the United States included, subscribe to a very ethical approach to clinical trials and human trial investigation. Does anybody want to make some comments about that? On the need to follow a very, very tight ethical window.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think all of us here on the call, in our protocol development, ethical questions are a core part of the development. Is this the right study at this time? Does it have the right patient burden? We even go into discussions, do we take too much blood? Do we? So we're trying to address this already from within our design process, but then of course, we have the checks and balances from the external review boards who also have to approve. So I think from my point of view, we have become much stronger there than we used to be. But it's a field of passion for mine, so sorry I spoke up so quickly. But yeah.
Any other comments about how companies approach the issue with ethics? As I think everybody on the call knows, but just in case, there's these things they're called institutional review boards, IRBs in the United States. They're called, I know this from our international thymectomy trial abroad, they're often called ECs or ethics committees. And they require very, very systematic, what's the word I'm looking for? That you toe the line very carefully with paperwork and how you phrase things to make sure that the ethical issues in human subject research is being followed. That's the best way I can describe that. But any other comments from the panel on ethics? Okay.
I mean, I'll just make one quick thought. I mean, I know at Regeneron we've actually published a position statement on ethics in clinical studies, which sort of contains details and how we ensure the highest quality of standards, ethics, integrity, as we're conducting clinical trials, developing these protocols, and ensuring that there's appropriate diversity in trial enrollment as well. So,
yeah. The diversity issue, I'll just briefly mention, I'm the co-chair actually for the Recruitment Retention Diversity Committee for NeuroNext, which is an NIH-supported clinical trials network. There's actually been a study in MG, the rituximab trial, in that network. Most of the trials are not in neuromuscular medicine, but there have been a couple in neuromuscular. But yes, this is a problem really across the board in many, many different disease states, outside neurology even, that we have not gotten good representative populations in our trials. If you look at African American recruitment, you're usually stuck around 5% or 7% of the population. Even in diseases that prominently affect that population. Native American recruitment has been horrendous. That group is particularly, from the research that I've done and talking to people in this field, it's particularly difficult to get engagement from the group, from the Native American group. And given the history of how that group was treated in the U.S., it's understandable. I think we're getting somewhat better as far as outreach to Hispanic groups, and there's different ways to do that. And I think a lot of the clinical trial study groups are starting to use these mechanisms to better publicize their trials, using churches, using libraries, using not city newspapers, but community papers that appeal and are read actually by those different communities to make things more readily available, better publicized to them. Anything else? Oh, yes, there was another one. How is funding of diseases like MG kind of looked at by industry for future research? How do you guys look? It's expensive to do clinical trials, but where does MG fit there? And maybe even expand that a little bit to rare diseases in general.
So I can start. Alexion, as a company for the last 30 years, has been focused in on rare diseases, and definitely over the last few years, been focused in on myasthenia gravis as well. We are committed to continuing research in myasthenia gravis. We have a pipeline of products that we're trying and effectively studying in MG as a disease. So our commitment to the disorder and continuing to improve upon therapies that we are bringing forth in this area is matched by our desire to bring forth these therapeutics in clinical trials. We also collaborate extensively with academic investigators through our grant programs and through investigator-initiated grants, which look at specific aspects of myasthenia gravis as a disease. So we solicit grant proposals, which are initiated by either physicians or scientists working in the myasthenia gravis disease area. So definitely future research is important to us as a company, and we continue to strive to further scientific research within the disease area.
I think that's a critical aspect you mentioned, Sanjay, which is the connection with the academics and how they can translate their basic science into actionable clinical research. And in fact, if you look at the argenx website, we don't do anything that is not rare. And 2 of our assets actually come directly from academic collaboration. So that cannot be underestimated, the impact that can have, especially here in these rare diseases.
Any other comments about funding? Just so everybody knows in the audience, the NIH does fund clinical research, but most of their money does not go to the clinical side of things. It's more translational and basic. It is very hard to get funding in general, but it can be particularly difficult to get clinical trials funded by an organization like the NIH. PCORI, which was actually founded by Obamacare, helps because it's largely designed to fund clinical projects. But it's a challenge. So this partnership with industry is crucial to move just about any field forward. It's something that has to be done in partnership with industrial, with pharma and our industrial partners. If there's any other comment about funding, please do that. Otherwise, I think it's time for each of you to have like a closing statement, just something you want to leave the audience with.
Okay, maybe I go first. I was just waiting a bit. Again, want to thank you, Dr. Wolfe, for moderating, MDA for inviting, and the patients for participating. And especially that last part is going to be crucial to continue to evolve this field. The cry we clearly heard for seronegatives to be heard. We will continue to work on that. But beyond that, in the other diseases that are under the tutelage here of MDA, if there's research ideas, thinking, let's have the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much for your input in this. Who wants to go next?
Thank you, Dr. Wolfe. Thank you, MDA, of course, and the patients as well. I am very happy that all of us are really, it seems like we're all on the same page in what is needed, what is needed with how we're communicating with the patients, how we're seeing the future, the excitement that we all have, the consistency with how we see the different ways to collaborate with academia, potentially each other. So I'm very, very happy to see that.
Same here, Dr. Wolfe, and thanks to the MDA for organizing this. I think as a closing comment, I would say that this aspect of patient outreach and patient education through initiatives like this is something that we look forward to participating in and continuing to engage the patient community with, and definitely look for additional avenues for continued dialogue with the patient community.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wolfe, the MDA, as well as all the patients and everyone online that took their time out this afternoon or this evening at this point. I think at Regeneron, we will always follow the science. And, one thing that we will also do is ensure that, patients' voices are heard. And, we'll have a process to continue to have that dialogue with both with MDA, other patient organizations, and make sure that, the science that we produce and the research that we do is going to address some of the actual challenges that the patients are facing. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I also would like to thank you very much, MDA, for organizing this. I think this is super useful symposium. Thank you very much to all the patients listening to us. I just want to say that at Janssen, we are very committed to hearing and also elevating your voices and really develop the field further. I think it's a super exciting area right now. And yeah, we'll see the next year. So thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you. I think it was a really nice discussion. I hope it was helpful for the whole audience. And again, I'd like to thank the MDA and Marissa. I mean, they do a fantastic job supporting all types of neuromuscular patient groups. And for this group, especially on the myasthenia gravis side. So Marissa, any comments, closing comments for us?
No, I just want to thank everybody. Lots of thank yous going around, but it really means a lot to our community when industry partners come and share your insights and perspectives and what the future might look like. I think it's really hopeful in myasthenia gravis. So thank you for being here today. And Dr. Wolfe, thank you for moderating.